Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Jedan je od vodećih američkih muslimanskih intelektualaca i aktivista. Godinama se aktivno bori protiv islamofobije i desničarskog ekstremizma, te se snažno zalaže za zaštitu građanskih prava i vjerskih sloboda. O položaju muslimana u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama, izazovima zakona o nacionalnoj sigurnosti, slobodi vjeroispovijesti i životu u Americi nakon Donalda Trumpa. Za Al Jazeeru govori Khaled Beydoun.
Professor Khaled Beydoun, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us. And so now the House passed Ilhan Omar's legislation to combat Islamophobia. The bill would address the rise in incidents of Islamophobia in the US, but also worldwide. But it still needs to pass the Senate before it gets approved by President Joe Biden's desk. But to you, as somebody who has been academically studying Islamophobia, how significant is this?
Yeah. So there's a lot of positives associated with it, right? So legislation would be a symbolic acknowledgement that Islamophobia is pervasive in the United States, that it's an issue, it's an issue concerned with bigotry that should be taken seriously by the government. But there's also some negatives associated with it, right? Because the way I've defined Islamophobia in my work, my academic work, is to think about it in terms of state policy, law, legislation, the Muslim ban, surveillance, the Patriot Act. And the state legislation is not going to acknowledge state action, state policy, state law as Islamophobia. So it's good in the sense that it's the government finally, recognizing that Islamophobia is a real issue in the United States, but it's only going to acknowledge one dimension of Islamophobia and not what the state is actually advancing.
Now, 20 years have passed since the September 11th attacks. Yeah. Now, as somebody who has been living in the US for, I believe, your entire life,
yep.
Do you see Islamophobia coming in waves, in the sense, depending on who sits in the White House?
Yeah, so the reality is this, and again, I think that it's critical to understand that Islamophobia is state policy. It's institutionalized, it's structural, it's built into the way that the federal government, the state government thinks about and polices Muslim communities and Muslim identity. But the way in which it's manifested publicly is contingent upon which administration is in government, right? So if it's a conservative or Republican administration like the Bush administration and specifically the Trump administration, it's more obvious, it's more explicit, it's more clear than it is when it's a Democratic administration, Obama or Biden now, who's in office obviously, where it's more hidden. So one thing that we know about Islamophobia, and it's sort of, like you've mentioned, it's 20-year tenure since the 9/11 terror attacks, is that it dips in form, it mutates in shape, it readjusts and readapts, but it's still very much central. It's very much focal to the way the United States government conducts not only its domestic policy and policing, but also its foreign policy.
But how does, and to what extent does American military interventionism, its wars throughout the world, how do they impact American Muslim everyday lives?
Yeah, well, so so when you step back and think about what Islamophobia is, and the way I've defined it in my academic work is that Islamophobia basically is that expressions of Muslim identity are tied to terrorism. So the way that it affects daily routine Muslim life is if an individual chooses to expresses Muslim identity in pious ways, right? So whether it's a woman wears the hijab or a Muslim man dons a beard or wears a thobe, those expressions, which are protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, free exercise of religion, are going to be tied or conflated to suspicion of terrorism. And that still exists, right? There are still policies in place that have been in place since the post 9/11 moment, surveillance, wiretapping of homes, digital surveillance now on social media platforms. So even though we don't have Trump in office and it's less obvious, it's still very much a palpable part of routine Muslim life.
But why does it become a major talking point? Why do Muslims become a major talking point and a major issue at each election cycle?
Yeah. Well, because we've been elevated, because Muslims have been elevated to
a security threat.
Yeah, exactly. So Muslim identity is tied to not only national security threat, so that's one dimension of it, but for many fringe and right-wing Republicans, it's cultural threat, it's civilizational threat. So it's a sort of the rise of Muslim identity in the Muslim population is a ominous threat to white majority America, white Christian America. So it's both national security and both cultural.
Now, being young, educated, and Muslim in the U.S. means navigating through multiple identities. You're a Lebanese, Egyptian, American, Muslim. How is America transforming or impacting Muslim identities?
Good question. So I'm not young anymore, unfortunately. I'm 40 now, so no longer young. But yeah, so
I mean, do you feel American first, or Muslim first, or Lebanese, Egyptian first?
Me? Oh, that's a tough question. So, I'm not much of a nationalist, to be frank with you. I think that, for me, I don't rank my identities. I think that, spirituality means, a great deal to me. National allegiance to the United States or Egypt or any nation state doesn't matter, is much to me. Yeah, so it's not a ranking system. I think they're all sort of like vital to who I am.
Do you see people such as yourself, Dalia Mogahed, Linda Sarsour, or Omar Suleiman, who are American-born, well-educated Muslims and very active on social media? Do you see yourselves as changing the paradigm of what it means to be an American Muslim, change the way Muslims are perceived and talked about in the U.S.?
So I'd like to think so, right? And I can only speak for myself, and I think the individuals you've mentioned, Dalia, Imam Omar, and Linda, and a range of other individuals have done great work in sort of humanizing who Muslims are. I'm somebody who I'm a law professor. I teach constitutional law, and even that, I'm known for my social media and in public writing. But above all, for me, when I think about American identity, I think about civil liberties, civil rights, and the cornerstone civil right in the United States is the ability to freely exercise your religion, whatever religion that is. If you're Jewish, to practice Judaism. If you're Christian, to practice Christianity. If you're Muslim, to practice Muslim identity. So I think that what this generation, what my generation of Muslim American quote-unquote leaders have done is to vindicate those American values, and second, be unapologetic about who we are as both Muslims and Americans, and harmonizing those two identities in ways that are not contradictory, but in fact are in line.
But do you see a common front being formed between marginalized and discriminated groups in the U.S.? I mean, we saw many American Muslims taking part in the Black Lives Matter campaign. Is this a common struggle?
So there are many overlapping dimensions of that struggle. I grew up in Detroit. Detroit is a majority black city. It's 90% black. My neighbors were black. People I went to school were African American, and dimensions of the African American struggle were not only intimate to me, but resonated deeply with me. Right, the idea that an individual was believed to be lesser and inferior on account of their racial identity. That is also true for Arabs, right? That is also true for Mexicans, and individuals who are relegated and viewed to be subordinate on account of their religious identity is very much the case for Muslim Americans. And I think a second important dimension is that the biggest segment of the Muslim population still remains black. Black Muslims are greater in number than Arab Muslims or South Asian Muslims in the United States. So when you talk about the black American experience, it converges in very complex and intimate ways with the Muslim American experience in terms of demographics, but also in terms of common struggle.
But when you say you grew up in Detroit,
yeah,
you know what I wanted to ask you, do American Muslims face discrimination and racism only from white Christian Americans, or have you ever faced Islamophobia from black Christian Americans?
Yeah, so Islamophobia is deeply embedded in American culture, and I think it would be simplistic to say that only white Christian Americans, are purveyors of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is, in reality, unleashed by, like you mentioned, black individuals, black Christians who don't have a lot of familiarity with Islam, who consume the same media, whether it's Fox or CNN or CNBC, which perpetuates these negative images of who Muslims are. I've been, called many bad names, right? Slurs by black people in Detroit and beyond the city of Detroit, by Latino people, by Asian people in the United States. So Islamophobia is not uniquely tied or exclusively tied to white Americans.
Right. I mean, how many decades did it take for American Muslims to begin representing themselves and have a voice of their own, you know, to talk on their own behalf? I mean, in the case of Bosnia, it took Bosnian Muslims at least 25 to 30 years after the war and genocide for a new, young generation of Bosnian Muslims to grow up who are well-educated, English-speaking, to start writing about their own suffering and wartime experience. Yeah. So it took about 30 years for Bosnian Muslims. In the case of American Muslims, how long did it take you?
So I'll say this, right? So there isn't sort of a, you know, there isn't a linear trajectory. I think that we're currently witnessing a Muslim American intellectual, cultural, political renaissance in the United States. But let's not lose sight of the fact that, you know, the most iconic and the most influential Muslim Americans emerged in the 1960s, right? People like Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X were, you know, courageous in their stance of, you know, about their Muslim identity and, you know, harmonize their black and Muslim identities in ways to address civil rights that were important to black people, but also important to Muslim people. But I think what's happened in the last 10 years as a consequence of Islamophobia rising as a considerable and ominous threat in the United States is that my generation is no longer afraid, right? I think that we don't fear what the government might do to us. We don't fear what white hate mongers or racists might do to us. It's critical for us to represent our community and to do it, you know, honestly and courageously.
Going back to Islamophobia, can you flesh out more about the differences between private, structural, and dialectical Islamophobia in the U.S.? And is there a dissonance in the way the American public talks about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism?
Good question. Yeah, so in my work, I talk about it being critical to understand that Islamophobia is systemic and a full-fledged system, right? Okay. So private Islamophobia is the form of anti-Muslim bigotry or violence that is inflicted by individuals, right? Individuals that are not tied to the state, whether it be a bigot walking down the street, you know, threatening to rip off the hijab of a Muslim woman, or somebody who vandalizes a masjid or a mosque, right? That is private Islamophobia. Structural Islamophobia, which not many people were talking about before I wrote my book, is the most, more nefarious, frightening form of Islamophobia that's advanced and enforced by the state, by the government, right? By way of law, by way of policy, state action, the travel ban, the Patriot Act, counter-radicalization, wars abroad, you know, funding, you know, Islamophobic governments. That is structural Islamophobia. Dialectical Islamophobia is this ongoing discourse, right, between the state by way of advancing Islamophobic policy built on this presumption that Muslim identity is tied to terrorism. And we see during critical moments of explicit Islamophobia, like the Trump administration, right, that the more explicit the law is, the more explicit the structural Islamophobia, what that does is that emboldens private Islamophobic violence. So we see a spike in hate crimes, hate incidents during moments of explicit structural Islamophobia. That is a dialectic, right? It's dialectical Islamophobia between the state and the polity. Now, the analogies between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is there's many similarities, right? So one similarity, obviously, is that they're both forms of religious bigotry, right? But I think what the distinction is between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism is that Islamophobia has also been racialized, right, in the minds of private Islamophobes. So if you walk down the street, right, in the United States specifically, and ask a lay American who knows very little about Muslims, who is a Muslim? What is the caricature of how you perceive or imagine Muslim identity? They're going to say Arab or South Asian, brown, long beard, turban, right? They have a racialized idea of who Muslims are.
Would I, as a white Muslim, be exposed to Islamophobia in the U.S.?
You may not be, actually, right? Because in the United States, there's this dissonance between, you know, white identity, white racial identity, and Muslim religious identity, because over centuries, right? Before the 9/11 moment, I've written about Orientalism, right? This concept of Orientalism.
Which is still Islamophobia, just in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. So Islamophobia is the spawn, the baby of Orientalism. Yeah, but there's this idea that whiteness is contradictory and inimical to Muslim identity, even though you're exactly right. So we're in a European country, where, you know, a European city which has a sizable Muslim population. This place would confuse most Americans. And I think you would walk into a room and people would, if you were to walk into a Muslim, a space in the United States, they'd probably think you're a convert, based on you being European.
But in the case, I mean, Islamophobia, the way it's perceived, the way it's felt by Balkan Muslims is sort of different from Islamophobia felt by American Muslims. It's very racial in the U.S., as you just said. In the case of the Balkans, Balkan Muslims are perceived by Serb and Croat nationalists as being the physical remnants of the much hated Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
So even though they are white, they are Slavic. The very fact that they are Muslims is a reason for them to be hated and to be destroyed, or at least expelled in every major war.
Yeah, and that's a critical distinction, and these are distinctions that I'm writing about in my next book, Islamophobia as a Global Phenomenon, right? So Islamophobia in Europe is distinct on a myriad of levels here in the Balkans, places like France, England, Spain, so on and so forth, because there's an intimate historical understanding that non-Muslims on this continent have about, Ottoman presence, for instance, right? The influx of immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East and so on and so forth. So there's a greater understanding of Muslim identity in Islam in Europe that in many respects breeds a more threatening form of Islamophobia here in Europe, right? And we see it being expressed culturally. We see it expressed in, very destructive, forms of law. The headscarf ban obviously being archetypal. But also the prospect of war, which we talked about, minutes before this interview, on account of religious identity. So when we think about European Islamophobia, and it's not monolithic, it's distinct, according to nation state and context. It's built upon this historical closeness to Islam that actually, in Muslims, that breeds even greater violence on the part of the Islamophobe in Europe, in my opinion.
Now, when you covered Islamophobia, you must have also dealt quite a bit with the far-right nationalism.
Yeah.
Do you see far-right nationalism in Europe and the U.S. as being on the same page?
It's a good question. So
there are clearly transatlantic ties between these far-right groups in Europe and in the U.S.
Yeah, so the reality is this, is that far-right nationalism and populism is no longer monolithic, right? There are distinct strands. There are religious strands. Right. In the United States, it was heavily evangelical, Christian-driven. Now we see the rise of, secular, atheist, white supremacist factions, neo-Nazis, white militants, which have strong transatlantic connections. Neo-Nazis in the United States have strong connections with neo-Nazis here in the United States. They're motivated by the same text, right? The Great Replacement is a manifesto that motivates white supremacists and nationalists here in Europe, but also Australia, New Zealand.
But in the case of the EU, you have far-right nationalists, being in the coalition government, in the case of Austria, or people like the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, or in the case of France, Marine Le Pen, or his party doing quite well in the local elections.
Yeah, so the far-right Islamophobic political presence in the in Europe, it's not fringe. It's becoming mainstream, and these are they're factions that are winning offices, and they very well might win presidential office and prime ministerships. But that's also the case in the United States, right? So far-right populism and white supremacy, obviously we saw it in the Trump administration, right? So that is. The Trump administration was driven, it made Islamophobia a campaign issue in the same way that Marine Le Pen makes Islamophobia a campaign issue in France.
But you know what I noticed, covering Muslims and far-right nationalism throughout the European Union, 20 years ago it was mostly far-right national parties that had a major problem with Muslims, immigration, and migrants and refugees. Now the rhetoric and the narrative that come out from far-right parties are almost the same as the ones you may hear from far left-wing parties when it comes to Islam and refugees and migrants. So there's almost no difference between far-right and left-wing parties.
In Europe?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the frightening thing in Europe, obviously, now is you're seeing the ascendance of secularism, right? Secularism being championed by many leftists, places like, people, France, England, so on and so forth. So the enshrinement of secularism, and the reality is that, Muslim immigrant, but also longstanding populations in places like Bosnia, for instance, are threatening this, secularist culture that the left is looking to, enshrine into government. So, but you're exactly right. There's Islamophobia on the left concerns me just as much as Islamophobia on the right.
Right, and finally, what can you tell us more about the atmosphere regarding academic freedoms at American universities? I mean, to what extent can you criticize the American government for its discriminatory policies towards Muslims or minority groups? And to what extent, I mean, and how does it play out when you are criticizing Israeli policies towards Palestinians?
Yeah, so I'm a tenured law professor who's made his career writing about national security, Islamophobia, and the experience of Muslim Americans. And I can tell you that there are a couple of red line issues. There are many universities and colleges that will police the academic freedom of academics like myself who write about these issues. But the one red line issue remains Palestine and Israel, right?
Why is it a red line issue? Because
of the influence of the Israeli lobby, the influence of Zionists within colleges and universities across the United States, the influence, and obviously now you may know that we have legislation in the United States which is looking to conflate and merge any political criticism of Israel's anti-Semitism.
Even the BDS movement.
Exactly, tied to the BDS movement, but also individuals who are not directly tied to BDS that are just engaged in honest and intellectual criticism of the human rights violations that
the idea is to root out any criticism of Israel?
Yeah, and that is the objective of this legislation.
I mean, so how does this impact American Muslim activists who may want to show solidarity with the Palestinian cause?
In a range of ways, right? So, I mean, if you have students, for instance, who are activists on Palestine, and I've spoken to many pro-Palestinian organizations across the United States and North America at large, they will be on blacklists, and that's going to prevent them from getting specific jobs or entry or admissions to specific universities. Their career mobility might be disrupted. Many academics have lost positions as a consequence of the statements they've made on Twitter or on Instagram. My social media during the events in Sheikh Jarrah was frozen for a week on Instagram. I had tweets that were shadowed. So the policing comes from the university itself, but also we live in a day now where social media is the new front of activism.
Was this the case in the US 30 years ago?
Yeah, well, so the forms of debate were distinct, right? So social media didn't exist 30 years ago, but the influence of the Zionist lobby was still quite strong 30 years ago. It was even, I would even argue, it was even stronger 30 years ago. So it was very much the case.
I mean, during the last offensive against Gaza, we saw the narrative slowly changing. There were more and more, for the first time, I mean, I read articles in New York Times that were critical of Israel. This was almost unimaginable 10 or 15 years ago. Why are we reaching this point now where more and more people are willing and have the courage to criticize Israel?
Yeah. Well, look, I think that there's a juxtaposition going on, right? So I think on the ground, grassroots elements, intellectual, cultural halls of power, which are left-leaning in the United States, places like New York Times, like you've mentioned, universities, colleges, are more progressive on Palestine because they're framing Palestine as a racial justice humanitarian issue in line with the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, right? So the Black Lives Matter movement generated considerable popular consciousness on Palestine in ways that were unprecedented. However, I think at the very top, though, right, at the very top of American governmental halls of power, both Republican and Democratic, they're still very staunchly committed to the Israeli state, that there will be no tolerance of legitimate and robust criticism of the Israeli government.
Right. Professor Khaled Beydoun, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you.